Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to my talk about the wolf in SGX clothing. My name is just introduced as Marion. Hello, this is me here for you on the right side of the screen. I recently moved to Portland, Oregon to start my work as a security researcher with Intel. And one of the areas I'm focusing on there is a technology called SGX, which is a short for software guard extensions. So, what am I going to be speaking about today? Oh, first of all, since I work for a big corporation, of course, there's legal disclaimers that I have to tell you that the information presented and opinions expressed are solely the responsibility of myself and don't represent the views of current, previous, or future employer. Also, I'm not here to advertise or devalue any current or future technology. Furthermore, I have some private disclaimers. I just recently started work at Intel, and this is a new topic for me. I'm not a software developer, exploit writer, shellcode specialist, cryptographer, and neither, please respect that I'm not a specialist in CPU bugs or cache side channels, so I will not be able to answer any questions on that subject. But yes, needless to say, it's interesting times to work at Intel. Intel has a lot of interesting technologies, and one of those is SGX. Now, how did I get to this talk topic of mine today? A long time ago, I was a young researcher. I was working in antivirus and later on in threat detection. That was about 2013, 2014 that Intel published news about their new technology to protect software in memory. And back then, security research got hiccups over hardware-protected software that no one else on the system can actually inspect. Because this is one of the principles of threat detection. We want to inspect things, or researchers want to inspect things and want to detect threats in binaries on disk or in memory or in network traffic. And SGX is preventing most of these techniques, or at least that's what people thought of back then. But let me start over. So what I was going to be speaking about today was my experiments of how to port actual malware or an actual threat into SGX to show how feasible is that, how possible is that, what problems arise through this tactic for threat detection, why would that be feasible or why would it not be feasible. First of all, though, let me introduce SGX to you. Prior to this presentation, I had some questions about what is SGX, what does it entail, and therefore I've prepared my first demo. I promised today to show my pet enclaves. One of those pet enclaves is called Francis. Francis is my very first own SGX application. Francis doesn't do a lot. Francis can catch bones and can encrypt bones and store those bones on disk, like catch a bone and dig it somewhere so that no one else can find it or decrypt it. Now, the first demo, as promised, will be Francis. And let's have a look what Francis does. There we are. All right. So my first pet, as mentioned, is Francis. Francis is not very complex. When I start Francis, he introduces himself saying his name is Francis. He's a pet enclave and he wags his tail, and if I don't give him a bone to dig, he has a very, very sad puppy face. Francis is a very simple SGX application, which is the clear text untrusted part of the SGX application, but it also entails an encrypted enclave, so an encrypted enclave which is loaded at runtime and is uninspectable in memory, as promised before. So, in our case here, Francis expects us to give him a bone. So we'll load him again and say, here is your bone. So Francis now has a bone. Again, Francis starts, wags his tail. Then, in a few seconds, he's very, very happy because he got a bone. Then he seals the bone, saves it on disk, and is ready again. Now, in the directory, we should have the sealed bone. So the text that I just handed over to Francis was accepted by the application, was handed over to the crypto enclave, and the crypto enclave sealed this bone and stored it on disk. So now we have the sealed bone.file within the directory. And if I look into that file, it's indeed just crypto gibberish. So Francis has successfully encrypted his bone. How does this work? Let's go back to the presentation. So, you just met Francis. What does SGX entail, or why is this interesting to have a crypto enclave inside of an application which can handle data in a secure way and store it in a secure way? SGX basically is a technology which enables application to guard their own secrets. SGX means that an application can have an encrypted and protected memory region which can contain code and data. In our case here, that means that the application would have the trusted part of it protected in memory, so it cannot be inspected, it cannot be debugged, it cannot be read by other applications, and it can be used for storing secrets. Security properties, as advertised by SGX, are that code and data remain confidential, that the integrity of the memory is granted, that different enclave instances are isolated, and that enclaves cannot be replayed. And as mentioned, the whole technology has an objective that an application is enabled to guard its own secrets from the operating system, from other processes, from other parts of the hardware itself, from privileged other entities on the system, and so on and so forth. This can be imagined as one of those pretty graphics from our Intel documentation show. No, I don't have a laser. Interesting. As you can see in this beautiful graphic, we have the applications running on top of the operating system, running on top of a hypervisor, running on top of the hardware. And as in the SGX technology, the hardware is the part that enables the crypto enclaves to be isolated. You can see that the enclaves are these little yellow boxes inside of the applications. They're protected from... I don't know what the dog is called, but I'll just tag him Francis for now. Hello. Yeah, so we have the crypto enclaves as part of the application, which interact directly with the hardware and are impossible to be read or interacted with from other parts of the system. How does this look and feel? My original background is I'm a malware analyst, or I come from the malware analysis field. I'm a reverse engineer, so that's how I actually tackled SGX. I tried to analyze it as if it were a piece of malware. For me, it's interesting that enclaves actually run in ring 0, in ring 3, sorry. Therefore, our usual applications that I, as an analyst, can potentially reverse engineer. Once they're loaded, though, they can't be inspected in memory, which means debugging is usually hard. The exit and the entry to an enclave is protected, which means once you start debugging or analyzing an SGX application, you will find out that you can't just enter and exit the enclave with the help of a debugger. Enclaves on the system are isolated from each other, so they can influence each other, and they're also protected from privileged code on the system. Also, they possess their own encryption keys, as is important for keeping secrets encrypted. For example, if you seal them and dump them on disk like Francis did with his bone, those keys are depending on the platform and the enclave itself. This also means that data encrypted by one enclave cannot be touched by a different enclave on the same system or by the same enclave on a different hardware platform. Also important, the enclave is supposedly protected by its own application. So even the own application which loads and manages the enclave is potentially an attacker. To enable SGX on Intel platforms, Intel introduced a whole set of new instructions. I will not go into great details here as of what these instructions are used for. Important in our case here is that we have instructions for creating and instantiating an enclave. We can enter an enclave, we can exit an enclave, and we can add new pages to the memory that the enclave can occupy. When analyzing an enclave, the important part is to watch out for the so-called enclu instruction, ENCLU, which is the userland part of the SGX instruction set. So whenever you debug an SGX application and you see the encl u instruction pop up, this could mean that after execution of this instruction, the execution will be handed over to the enclave, which means that your debugger will possibly lose control over the debugged application. One thing that I have to state about the SGX applications that I'm presenting here today is that sadly Intel wouldn't let me sign my experiments, which means that all the enclaves that I'm presenting today are debug enclaves, which entails that these enclaves can actually be debugged. I also wanted to say that the experiments that I conducted do not rely on this feature. So the data that I'll be showing today can be, or the experiments that I'm showing today can be conducted with production enclaves as well. The requirements for executing SGX applications on a system, the most important ones are those three listed on this slide. Most importantly, we need hardware which supports SGX. This means processor families after what we internally call the Skylake generation. We can figure out whether the hardware supports SGX as an instruction set through the CPU ID leaf number 7, which is beautifully lined out in the Intel Software Developers Manual. Also, Intel SGX needs to be enabled in BIOS, which can be controlled by the IA32 feature control MSR, the model-specific register, namely the bit number 18. It's responsible for enabling SGX within BIOS. And the third thing we need is the SGX runtime. The SGX URTS or URTS sim needs to be installed on the system in order to be able to execute SGX applications. And one thing I found out while debugging or while developing my paths was that in theory you can't actually execute SGX on the system without the respective hardware, which entails that you can't develop those applications on a virtual machine unless you use the simulator, which means that you can't actually, for example, write your ransomware on a virtual machine and protect your host system while you debug your ransomware by using the simulator, which came in very handy for me for my second experiment when I tried to port actual ransomware into an SGX enclave. Part of the motivation for this talk today for me was to show that it doesn't actually make much sense to port standard malware or default malware into an SGX enclave, because SGX enclaves, as you will see in a minute, are rather limited in what they can actually do in the system. This idea in mind, I brought the discussion up in our team at Intel, and my colleague said that this is actually not entirely true, because there's ways to enable malicious code which is protected within an SGX enclave on a system and bypass those limitations that SGX usually faces. So the main components of this talk are, for once, a piece of malware which is limited through the limitations of SGX, which is now going to be my demo number 2, which I called George. George is a piece of ransomware which acts from within a crypto enclave. Yes, and with the demo number 3, with the second part, we will see malware which is actually not restricted by the natural restrictions of SGX enclaves. All right, let's have a look at what George can do. So, back into the VM. Yeah, as mentioned, I developed all my enclaves, or all my malicious enclaves inside of my virtual machine, so I wouldn't actually encrypt the host system. So here's George. George is a valid ransomware. It's mostly, I try to stick to the traditional ransomware coding standards and copy-pasted most of its code from the internet. I've prepared a test directory here in my home folder. It's called test here, and it includes some directories out of the Python installation. So we have include files. Here we see lots of header files in there. If I show the content of, let's see, take the node header. You can see this is actual clear text. So it's a valid Python header file. It's all text. And now if I go on and execute my ransomware, I will execute George, and George will go on to enumerate those directories within the test here and will encrypt all the files that are lying in there. And afterwards, we can have a look at the ransom notes, which will say that we have to pay lots of money to get our files back, like ransomware usually does. So let's see, I'll execute George. George is a rather unusual ransomware because it gives us debug output. Usually, if George were real ransomware out in the wild, it would probably not give debug output, but that would be rather boring to look at. So George does debug output. And George tells us that, if I scroll in the beginning, over here. So George tells us that it's enumerating directories, namely those directories inside of my test directory, and that in there, the enclave itself starts to encrypt files that are located in those test directories. We can now go on and have a look at where was our node.h. So node.h doesn't exist anymore, but it's now, I don't know if you can see that down here. Node.h is now node.h.enc, which stands for encrypted. And if I print it now, I see that the content has vastly changed because now it's encrypted. So this was just a demo for a piece of ransomware, which in theory is rather boring, except that these files that are now encrypted in the test directory were encrypted from within an SGX enclave. Now, let's have a look at how this works and why this works, and why this is fascinating, and why this is actually a bad idea if we were real ransomware authors. How do they implement that? How is the layout of the SGX application? So we have three parts, as with every SGX application. We have the application part, which is the untrusted part, the clear text application, which can be inspected. We have the crypto enclave, which is protected by the memory encryption engine. It's not inspectable. You can't dump it. You can't debug it. And we have helper functions, which help us forward data into the SGX enclave and return data from the enclave and help the enclave access functionality within the application part. This would look as follows. So, as promised, we have the enclave, and this pink color looks amazing on that screen. I hope you can read that. So we have the enclave, which exports exactly one function, namely a function called start ransomware, which is the function which would then start enumerating files on disk and read the plaintext file from those files, and then encrypt the data and write it into the encrypted file, and then deletes the plaintext file and drops the ransom node, like the most simple version of a ransomware. On the other side, we have the application, which is the untrusted part. As promised, the untrusted part comes with a main function, which goes on to load the enclave and call the start ransomware function. And it also provides us with other parts that enable the interaction of the encrypted enclave with the operating system. As briefly mentioned before, enclaves are fairly restricted in the functionality they support because they're only allowed to load trusted libraries, which are libraries that are accredited to be used for the use within crypto enclaves. Those do not include APIs that enable the enclave to interact with the file system directly, which means if we want certain system calls, such as open file or read a file or write a file, we need to have helper functions inside of the application. This is called O-calls. So we have E-calls, which are calls from the application towards the enclave, and we have O-calls, which are calls from the enclave to the untrusted part of the application. Because this way we can actually interact with the file system from within the enclave. That means our application supports certain helper functions, as listed here on the screen: ocall underscore open dir, ocall underscore read dir, ocall underscore open and read and close and rename and write. These are the API calls that we will need for the enclave to be able to enlist files and encrypt files. And the technique of OCalls enables the application to actually access those APIs from within the application. In this scenario, we have a lot of interaction between the enclave and the actual application. The point here being, why I think that this is a bad idea for a ransomware author, is that the interaction with the application is visible and can be seen by the operating system. And more importantly, a reverse engineer could go on to analyze the application, so the untrusted part, and figure out which functionality the application provides to the crypto enclave. In practice, how is this implemented? The interaction between an enclave and its application part is defined in the EDL file, the enclave definition file. The enclave definition is like defining the meaning of a word. We define the interaction of our enclave with the application, which means that the EDL is essentially a list of functions which are exposed from the enclave to the application, and vice versa, which functions are exposed from the application to the enclave. This interaction, as just mentioned, goes two directions. So for the application to interact with the enclave, we need an eCall, and the other way, we need an OCall to be able to exit the application, to exit the enclave, so is the application. For the generation of these functions, we have a routine called SGX iterator. This routine generates the translation, which helps exit from the application to enter the enclave and the other way around. Those helper functions are there for verifying input and output, which go into the application, out of the, or into the enclave and out of the enclave and into the application, out of the application. These are there for security purposes, of course, to check input parameters. The whole theory of this is beautifully explained in this graphic exposed by the Intel documentation. Again, we see that we have the untrusted part of the application on the left side and the trusted part of the enclave on the right side. We have edge routines, which were generated by the iterator tool, which check parameters that are handed from the application towards the enclave and check output from the enclave going back to the application. This means that for once, for a very little enclave with very little functionality, we have a lot of code overhead which is produced. And a lot of this code is actually inspectable. A lot of this code can be analyzed by a malware analyst and can be found to be malicious. One thing, though, that I found out while writing my ransomware is that as of recently, Intel started providing a trusted library called the Protected File System Library, which enables enclaves to write and interact with their own files in the file system. Important here to note is that enclaves are still not able to interact with files that are already present on the system, but they can create their own files on the system, which is actually very helpful when writing ransomware. The Protected File System Library is a basic subset of what we would expect from the C-file API. I've listed the functions that are present within this library on this screen. And one thing that was very convenient there is that I can actually access an API called SGX fopenAutoKey, which will create an SGX file, which is automatically encrypted with a key derived from the enclave sealing key. So I don't even have to mess around with encryption, which in the past, like my experience with ransomware authors showed me that their biggest problem is that they don't know how to use crypto APIs. And in the case of SGX, SGX takes this, this problem from the authors and just provides an API which automatically encrypts with strong encryption. This entails, though, as mentioned, we have the untrusted part, which can interact with the normal file system and files on the disk. And we have enclaves, which can only interact with SGX files. For enabling enclaves to read and delete or rename or move files on the file system that were already present, which we would want as a ransomware, we need to, again, implement an OCall, which goes through the application to the file system. While, on the other hand, the application can never actually access or modify SGX files. Sorry, it can access and modify them, but it cannot read them because they're encrypted and protected by the enclave part of the application. So this is very convenient. But altogether, my assessment of SGX-protected ransomware isn't very good. When one tries to port standard applications or standard malware into SGX, the problem is that due to the lack of trusted libraries or due to the lack of APIs, the functionality of those enclaves is actually very limited. Like the potential of execution that one has within the crypto enclave are very limited by definition. Furthermore, the system needs to meet the SGX prerequisites, which I mentioned in the beginning. So SGX needs to be enabled in BIOS, the hardware needs to support it, and the actual runtime needs to be installed, otherwise you can't execute SGX applications. Furthermore, enclaves should be signed, as mentioned before, so they are actually protected by SGX, and the Intel signing process isn't all that easy, so it would not be possible. I can tell because I tried for a random ransomware author to request a signing key from Intel, then sign an NDA and get his malicious enclaves signed, so that would be a problem. But finally, what's the biggest problem for ransomware authors? As I figured out, enclaves on disk before they are loaded by the application are actually not encrypted. This was very interesting. I was not aware of this fact, that I could just load the enclave binary, which is a DLL on Windows or a shared object on Linux, into my disassembler and just look into the code. And what is impressive there is the amount of code which is generated by SGX itself, which in our case here would be 535 functions, which are created by the compiler, and only one function within this binary which are created by the code author. So we have the list there, or the ransomware function, which I displayed here. This will be the only function that the actual application code, or that the author wrote in the application, and the rest of the function are created by SGX. As far as I remember, malware authors want to go small. They want their binaries to be small and not like huge and bloated, but also they want their code not to be like all that clear in front of the analyst when the analyst loads the malicious application into their disassembler. What's more important, though, or more interesting in the case of ransomware is that if I were an analyst and I would look at this SGX ransomware and I would see that the application interacts with the protected file system API, this would be exactly the first thing I would look at. Because this is obviously where the application tries to hide something. And since the binary is in total clear text, we can follow down these APIs in the binary and figure out which data is being dumped into our encrypted files. And this would be exactly what the application tries to hide. All right, so much for ransomware. Another experiment that I conducted, if I run the application in my virtual machine, I might also want to state I'm not a Linux specialist, but I figured out with strace I can log APIs. If you're more into monitoring of Linux systems, you might have better ideas of how to monitor API calls in Linux. But that turned out for me to be the most simple and most efficient way of trying to monitor my ransomware. So I executed the binary on my Linux system, and I figured out that I can see where the plain file is being read, which would be the lines highlighted in red, which you can possibly not read. It says open and read. This is where the data is being read. In blue, we have the crypto calls, or like the calls where the data, the red data, is being written back into the encrypted file. In our case, it will be the file makefile.enc. And in the lines marked in green, we see where the ransom node is being placed. I don't know if you can read that down here. It says, you have been pawned. Haha, yoo-hoo. So by using strace, I can see everything the application or the ransomware actually performs on the system. So we could technically monitor those applications and still see what they're doing. In the end, what does it mean for feasibility? We can probably put most pieces of common malware into an SGX enclave. For most parts of it, we would have to exit the enclave to actually interact with the operating system, with the file system, with the network stack, etc., which would still expose our functionality. For threat detection, that would mean, since the binaries on disk are clear, we can actually scan them, we can create signatures. It would be a bit of a problem to spot exactly the malicious functionality, since there is like more than 500 functions that are not malicious. But it will be possible, and still we can monitor those applications and determine their behavior. All right, so much for ransomware. So if I were a ransomware author, I would actually not try to put my ransomware into SGX. But as promised in the beginning, there's options for malware authors to still achieve stealthy execution within enclaves. And this is my demo number 3, or my pet number 3. My pet number 3 is named Martha. Martha is a pet enclave which is very plain in the beginning. So if I would load this binary or this SGX library into this assembler, I wouldn't see much. I would see a function which opens a file, which reads the file, which loads the content of that file into a dedicated section, and then jumps into that section. If I have that in a disassembler, I would naturally not see what the content of that file is that's being read. And in our case here, we'll see that this file is the actual critical component. So let's have a look at the, at the demo number 3. Yeah, my virtual machine is called Michelle, because I think everything should have a proper name. Okay. Okay, so now I'm in the directory of Martha. The directory is called Fun and Profit, because everything which has to do with exploitation needs to be, or with abuse of machines needs to be called Fun and Profit. And in there now, if I execute the Martha application, the application says it's been loaded and executes where the enclave says it's up and running, and the enclave wants to execute system calls, can't actually execute system calls because the enclave doesn't support that. But then the enclave goes on and loads the file as promised. The file contains shellcode. That shellcode is being loaded into an executable section. The executable section is being executed. And then the application goes on to say, yoo-hoo, we can execute system calls now. And then the next thing you see is that there's a new shell that just popped up. Now, what is it that just happened? I had a very clear enclave binary, an enclave library, which wasn't supposed to do anything malicious because there's obviously nothing in there. We have a file which is encrypted on disk, which doesn't tell us much, but since we read the log file here, or the log output from the application, we know that this file contains shellcode. That shellcode is being loaded by the enclave and then executed, and then leads to the execution of a system call. In that case here, it's the application saying that it will execute the system call being popping this shell on my virtual machine. But in the end, this system call was initiated by the enclave. Now let's have a look about, on how that would work. In the end here, our enclave has just opened up a shell on the system. This is a real shell. I can execute any command that I could execute on a usual Linux shell. All right, how did we get there? Like, why would our enclave binary be able to open up a shell? Because it's a sneaky bastard, as promised. What did I do? So the enclave, as mentioned before, is not capable of issuing a system call. It's not capable of opening a file. It's not capable of opening a shell. It's not able to do any major modification to the system it's being executed on, because the actual intent of an enclave is just to guard secrets, not to modify things. One thing there is that enclaves, once they're loaded into memory, they're encrypted and protected and everything, but they're not protected for code modification or for modification of the enclave at runtime. By the way, here's our runtime. Now, how would we achieve this? How would we deal with the functionality limitations of the enclave? The original idea of modifying an enclave at runtime was first documented by Joanna Rutkowska in 2013, where she said, enclaves are clear on disk, but once they're loaded into memory, they're encrypted. Once they're encrypted, no one can look inside what they're actually doing, and then they could change their opinion on what they want to do at runtime dynamically. As mentioned before, though, even if the enclave changes its mind on what it wants to do at runtime, it's limited by the limitations of SGX, so it cannot actually interact with the system. My enclave could. Now let me tell you how I taught the enclave to do this. Again, we have an enclave binary. Our enclave binary can fetch and decrypt shellcode. It can copy that shellcode to an executable section. It can execute that shellcode. And then that shellcode then goes on to prepare the actual functionality that I want to add to my SGX enclave and asks the application to execute that functionality. This technique is called a system call proxy. What a system call proxy does, a system call proxy is pretty stupid. System call proxy does nothing else than execute system calls, and it is taught by a different entity, in our case here the SGX enclave, of what the system call should be. So, again, we have an e-call coming from the application which tells the enclave to start executing. When then the enclave starts loading the shellcode out from a file, it decrypts that shellcode and loads the shellcode. It will execute that shellcode. The shellcode prepares arguments for the system call that it wants to execute. It knows which system call it is. It knows which system call number it wants to execute. It prepares those arguments and packs them up. It wraps them up in a package and hands that package over to the application, where the application, not knowing what to expect, just unpacks the arguments and executes a system call with the arguments that the shellcode defined to do. And later on, we can just continue execution inside the enclave and fetch the next piece of shellcode and execute the next system call, and this way piece together the functionality that we want to teach our enclave to show at runtime. How is this implemented? We have the enclave shellcode, which in this case here is loaded from a file, and the idea from John Rutkowska was loaded from a remote server. In the end, it doesn't really matter where the enclave, where the shellcode comes from. The fact being that the shellcode is the part of our malicious application which contains the actual functionality, and is the part that needs to be kept a secret from the analyst. An interesting bit here, it wasn't all that easy to define an executable section inside of a Linux binary. I might also want to state I'm not naturally a Linux person, so I had some issue finding this out, and funny enough, the solution for creating an executable section in C is the attribute section directive, which is not very well documented in that aspect. But I figured out how to add myself an executable section because someone on Stack Overflow had asked what this command actually does, which I thought was very funny. So the guy wasn't sure what it does. I read the command and saw I get a new section with AWX enabled, so I have the executable bit for that section set, which means that I can actually load executable code or my shellcode into that section, jump there and execute it, and change my enclave at runtime. So this way we have a section. As mentioned, we also have shellcode. I'm rather a noob in how to write shellcode, so my shellcode is not very pretty, but it also doesn't have to be, because since we define the executable section ourselves, we have all the space that we need. We define it ourselves. Also, we're not restricted by any zeros in the shellcode, so this is really very much the most plain shellcode you might have ever seen. A real shellcode is fairy tale. Another idea for the future to spare the executable section would be to actually implement this shellcode with return-oriented programming inside the enclave, but that's still a future to do. What do we do with this shellcode? This shellcode hands over execution to a proxy function, the proxy server inside of the application. As mentioned, enclaves can only access system calls that are provided by trusted libraries, which are very little. This way, we need the system calls to be executed by a different entity, in our case, the application, which here is called a proxy. How is this implemented? So in Linux, the system is very easy. To execute a system call, we need the system call number, and we need to place the arguments for our system call in the right order into the respective registers. So all we need to do is we need to collect those arguments, we need to pack them into a package, we need to figure out the system call number, this is what the shellcode does, and then hand this over to our proxy function, which unpacks the arguments, assigns them to the right registers, and then just executes the syscall instruction. This can be done as follows. So, as mentioned, the client loads and executes the shellcode in our dedicated shellcode section. The shellcode is the brains of our application, so it defines what the following system call will be able to do. The shellcode marshals the arguments that the system call expects to be able to execute. And then the shellcode pivots to the actual proxy function inside of the application. Important here is that inside of an enclave, you can't actually jump to executable code outside of the enclave. So there's no way you can jump directly to the pivot function, to the proxy function, which means we need pivot functions inside of the enclave, which enable our shellcode to exit properly from the enclave through the bridge functions defined by the iterator as introduced before, and access the proxy function inside of the application code. So we need those pivot functions, and then in the end, the proxy can unpack the Marshal arguments and execute our desired system call. This way we get our shell from within the enclave, and the reverse engineer stays in the dark, which is the actual problem about this approach. So without getting to see the shellcode, which in the beginning lies encrypted on disk, then is loaded by the encrypted enclave and protected by encryption at all times, the reverse engineer can't actually see what the shellcode wants to do. Putting together the system call arguments is rather easy. Now all system calls on Linux have their assigned number and are fairly well documented as in which arguments they expect. So we just need to put those arguments together to be able to execute the respective system call. In our case, it was execv. We need to marshal those arguments properly and prepare the argument stack which the syscall instruction expects to execute. In this case here, I used rip relative addressing to find the pivot functions inside of the enclave, because the enclave layout doesn't change after the enclave is loaded. And with the help of these pivot functions, I can proxy out into the untrusted part and happily execute my system calls. The proxy function doesn't have to change much. As mentioned, it's very stupid. It just executes the syscall instruction with the arguments it unpacks from the marshaled data. And this way I can reuse this proxy function for any system call that I want to execute from within my enclave. The proxy itself, the code is rather thin. As you can see, the proxy function expects a pointer to the input, which are the marshaled arguments. It can then unmarshal the arguments and assign them, in this case, to integers which are the respective registers that the syscall instruction expects. And then with this little piece of inline assembly here on the bottom of the screen, we can execute the syscall instruction with the assigned arguments from the marshal data we received from the enclave. And this way, all of a sudden, our enclave can do magic. Now, what does this mean? Why is this a problem that the enclave can change its behavior? This means that we can actually hide malicious software inside of a crypto enclave or protect it by a crypto enclave at runtime, so you can hide the functionality that is expected from this application. This is a problem for threat detection, since the clear shellcode is never actually seen. It's a problem for forensics and incident response, since we can't analyze the malicious application. We don't know what it did in the past. So we see changes to the system, we see which files have been created, we have timestamps and all of that that we use in incident response, but we can't actually tell in which order of time this has happened, or which changes have been conducted by which part of our malicious applications, in case we have more than one crypto enclave. The one thing that remains the same is the security monitoring. We can still monitor API calls, but if you've ever tried in a large network to monitor all the API calls on all of your endpoints, you will figure out that this is not actually a feasible way to monitor your crypto enclaves. So finally, for threat detection changes, it remains the same as I said before. We still have pattern matching. We still can match for patterns in files on the disk. In that case, we need to have luck with the static libraries. As mentioned before, enclaves are a large part static libraries, and the malicious code isn't very easy to spot inside of those libraries, so automatic generation of patterns which match for malicious enclaves will be very hard to generate. In case of monitoring, as mentioned, we have large amounts of data. We have lots of API calls that happen on the system, and we can't actually monitor our whole network just on the basis of API calls. We can still monitor on the network perimeter, though, and see outgoing and incoming network connections. And finally, incident response and forensics. There's code which is executed in this scenario which is never inspectable. So we have the shell code which lies encrypted on disk or is downloaded through a encrypted protected network connection, which is loaded directly into the encrypted enclave and executed there and can't actually be seen while it's executing. And in the end, just causes the application, the untrusted parts, to issue system calls. So a reverse engineer in this case would not actually see which code is being executed by the malicious application. But looking through this system, it came to my mind that a while ago I looked at a malicious binary which incorporated a scripting engine and would, through an HTTPS connection, download Lua scripts. So it had a Lua scripting engine and would download and execute those scripts. And I was facing the same problem. I had the binary, I did not have any other data on the incident, so I did not have any of those scripts, and I did not know what the application did in the past. Again, implementing an SGX-protected application or SGX-protected malware is rather tedious. SGX isn't a technology which can be easily understood and easily used, as opposed to, for example, a scripting engine. However, it poses a potential risk in the future for incident responders. It poses a large potential for headache for security engineers which try to investigate incidents where enclaves were used. And this could be a big challenge in the future for our kind to monitor and to investigate. All right, so the conclusion is SGX is best used for guarding secrets and shouldn't actually be used for guarding entire applications. The special interaction when implementing enclaves, the special focus should be put on the enclave interactions, like what goes into the enclave, what comes out of the enclave. This is also important for monitoring of SGX applications. The question here is what exactly we want to monitor for. Monitoring for every API call that's issued by an SGX-protected application is not feasible, but what is interesting, what's an interesting research approach in the future is to watch the behavior of SGX-protected applications over time, so to get a profile of what an SGX application usually does. And as soon as it starts changing this behavior, this is a point of where we should start thinking about investigating further. Classical threat detection is not actually affected much by the SGX technology itself. Applications can still be scanned and patterns can still be found. But where we find actual challenges is, as mentioned, forensics and incident response. All right, this was my actual presentation. At this point, I would like to thank researchers who have contributed to these experiments of how to port malware into SGX. This would be Rodrigo Branco, Gabriel Negrera Barbosa, Enrique Kawakami, Eugene or Evgeny Rodionov, the rest of the Intel Storm team, Mark Gentry, Matt Swish, Jonathan Broussard, and Joanna Rutkowska. Thank you very much for your attention, and I think I don't have any time for questions.